So good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Bob Horenstein, and I'm the Director of Community Relations and Public Affairs for the Jewish Federation of Greater Portland. The screening of the film, Who We Are, A Chronicle of Racism in America, and tonight's talkback with Jeffery Robinson are co-sponsored by the Federation's Jewish Community Relations Council, or JCRC, chaired by Hank Kaplan, and the Vancouver Avenue First Baptist Church, led by our good friend, Pastor Matt Hennessy. This past April, the JCRC and the church jointly co-sponsored and planned a civil rights mission to Atlanta, Montgomery, Selma, and Birmingham for 42 individuals, most of them from the local Jewish and Black communities. This trip was not just educational. Calling it simply educational wouldn't do it justice. The trip was powerful, emotional, and inspiring, just like the film that we'll be discussing tonight. Upon our return from the American South, we wanted to make sure that the trip was not a one-off. That is, the participants wanted to make sure that we would continue to build on our relationships and find ways to collaborate, because the two communities have many shared interests, including combating hate, discrimination, and insidious efforts to erase or at least obscure our country's history of racism and slavery. So this evening, we are thrilled to have with us Jeffery Robinson, who is coming to us from Boston, Massachusetts. And we know it's past 9:30 p.m., so thank you for staying late with us, Jeffery. In a moment, I'm going to ask my longtime friend and veteran facilitator of Black Jewish Dialogues, Barbara O'Hare, to introduce herself, and then to introduce Jeffery. Before I do that, just a couple of housekeeping notes. First of all, we know that some of you had some technical issues getting onto the film, and perhaps some of you weren't able to actually see it yet. Those technical difficulties should have been resolved, and we have extended the access to the film to the end of the month. Also, if you have Netflix, that's another option for watching the film. Second, for tonight, to ask a question, and we will get to as many questions as we can, please use the Q&A function, as the chat function will be disabled. So with that, I want to turn it over to Barbara O'Hare.
Thank you, Bob, and thank all of you for being here tonight. It is my pleasure and my honor to be in the presence of Jeffery Robinson. I am a native-born I'm a native-born Oregonian, and I am the founder of an organization called Dialogues Unlimited, and I have been a part of the Jewish community since I was 5, and the African-American community, of course. So I just want to welcome Jeffery on Pacific time and introduce him to you shortly here. For this is going to be quite the treat, and I encourage you to lean in and to listen. I don't think I could have written any faster to try to capture all of the factoids that came out of this film from Jeffery, so thank you for that. So Jeffery Robinson, producer and writer, is the founder and chief executive officer of the Who We Are project, which aims to become one of the central voices in correcting the narrative on our shared history of anti-Black racism in the United States. Jeffery is a former deputy legal director and director of the American Civil Liberties Union's Trone Center for Justice and Equality. Since graduating from Harvard Law School in 1981, he has had 4 decades of experience working on criminal and racial justice issues. He has tried over 200 criminal cases to verdict and has tried more than a dozen civil cases representing plaintiffs suing corporate and government entities. Jeffery was one of the original members of the John Adams Project and worked on the behalf of one of the 5 men held at Guantanamo Bay, charged with carrying out the 9/11 attacks. In 2015, Jeffery joined the ACLU, and on April 1st, 2021, he left the ACLU and launched the Who We Are Project. Jeffery is a nationally recognized trial attorney and respected teacher of trial advocacy. He is a faculty member of the National Criminal Defense College and has lectured on trial skills all over the United States. He is past president of the Washington Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers and a past member of the board of directors and life member of the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. Jeffery is also an elected fellow of the American College of Trial Lawyers. Further, he speaks nationally to diverse audiences on the role of race in the criminal justice system and the history of anti-Black racism in the United States. Welcome, Jeffery, and welcome audiences wherever you are.
Thank you so much for having me this evening.
So let's start off with this. I mentioned the civil rights mission that we participated in because we learned so much going to the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, so much that I never learned in school. And you mentioned in the film that you had learned a lot yourself. And I'm just wondering, in doing the research about the history of our country, what compelled you in the first place to want to do that research?
Well, I wasn't really looking to do that research. I mentioned this in the film, but there was some family deaths in 2011. My wife's younger sister and her mother passed away, and her younger sister was a single mom. So our then 12-year-old nephew became our 13-year-old son, and moved from Queens, New York, where he was living, to Seattle, Washington, to live with my wife and I. And we did not have children, and I was terrified. I had no idea how to raise this young man and what I needed to do. So I was looking for things that would help me just raise a child, raise a young teenager. But I had a conversation with him about going out at night and what he should do if the police rolled up. And I found myself telling him the exact same thing that my father told me in the 1960s. And when my father told me those rules, he told me that it was the same thing his father told him in the 1930s. And that was emotionally crushing. And as I continued to look for things on how to help me raise a young Black man, I started finding these historical facts that were just kind of, parallel to what I was looking for. And I would read something and think, I never heard of that before. And I would search it a little further. And then I'd think, I don't believe that. That's just the internet. And then I'd search it a little further and go to original source documents. And one thing would lead me to 3 things, which would lead me to 10 things. And the chief of staff at the Who We Are Project, who was my paralegal in my private practice criminal defense practice, started asking me, I'm copying all these articles and I'm getting all these factual documents. What case are we working on? And I said, I don't know what we're working on. I just need you to get this stuff. And one of the things that we're trained to do as criminal defense lawyers is that if you have an incredibly complicated set of facts, put it in a timeline and just see what happens. And when I did that, the top of my head came off. And I saw a very clear, unambiguous, and unfiltered picture of why America looks like it does today. And a huge portion of that picture has been obscured since the end of the Civil War. And I think that's one of the reasons why, as we say in the film, we have taken 2 steps forward and 3 steps backwards on racial justice. really throughout our entire history. And that is what will happen if you're trying to solve the racial justice problems with solutions that aren't designed to get at the real root causes of the problem. And you can't know the root causes of the problem if your history has been completely stolen from you. So that's why George Orwell was right. Who controls the past controls the future. And if you can wipe something out of the minds of people like it never happened, then that has no impact on why things look the way it does today.
Barbara?
So that was my motivation, and I started doing that. I started doing more and more research, and I started giving more and more presentations around the country, and this was just a side gig. I had a criminal defense practice, and so I was just going around the country where I could get invited, speaking to as many people as I could about this. And in 2017, I happened to speak to some federal judges and lawyers in Manhattan. And one of the people in the audience was a criminal defense lawyer whose name was Sarah Kunstler, and she's also a filmmaker. And it was that kind of unknowing introduction that led me to be talking to you today.
Barbara, go ahead.
My question for you is, in the movie, you say that no one is always good or always bad, like the United States. We do great things and then we do harmful things. And one of the reasons people fear the racial bias label or even being labeled as a racist so much is because they think it means that they are bad people. And everyone in mainstream America has been touched by racist ideologies, whether they admit to it or not. Racial biases, in a sense, their sense of self-worth because of the historical programming or the lack of historical knowledge. So what do you think are the best processes for moving people of this mindset to becoming anti-racist and work toward societal change without intimidating them and just to facilitate the process? How can we get these people out of this? What can we say? What can we do?
Well, and one of the things that I was taught as a criminal defense lawyer is that when you're cross-examining a witness, you don't have to be cross. You can be polite, but you can still confront someone, which is what I tried to do with the gentleman at the beginning of the film with the Confederate flag in Charleston, South Carolina. And I will tell you that after screening this film for a group of criminal defense lawyers, an officer in the Marine JAG Corps came up to me and he said, I really want to thank you for the way you spoke to that man, because that man is essentially every male in my family. And I'm going to ask them to watch this movie. And the fact that you weren't yelling at him, the fact that you spoke to him with respect, the fact that you shook his hand at the end, but the fact that you didn't back down and were, pushing back on what he said. He's like, that's what I need to start this conversation. So someone told me, I wish I had thought of it this way, but someone told me that folks who are expressing extreme views like the gentleman in South Carolina, they need our outrage and our volume of outrage to drown out their ignorance. And so had I just started yelling at him, you're a jerk, how can you believe that? You're a racist, that's not true. Then it kind of devolves into a shouting match, and there's nothing that really comes from that. But I will tell you, we haven't changed that man's mind or, turned him to be a different kind of person, but he has contacted us since this movie was released. And he is very concerned about the way he appears. He says, I look like a racist. And I'm not a racist. If I saw someone from the KKK trying to carry a Confederate flag, I would want to beat them up. And what's happening with him is, cognitive dissonance. Maybe for the first time in a long time, maybe the first time ever, he has had to think about this issue in a way that he didn't before. And one of the things you can't see in the film is that this conversation was between me and him. There were a whole bunch of people watching, because this was a Sunday in Charleston, South Carolina, right on the waterfront. And people are down there all the time. And all of a sudden, there's a black guy with a TV camera talking to these guys who are down there every weekend. And people were like, what's happening here? So I was talking to him, but I was also talking to those people listening. And so I think that you can push back with great vigor and force in a tone of voice like the tone of voice I'm talking to you right now. And that's one of the ways that you reach people, is getting them to hear you and being direct with them. Nobody alive is responsible for slavery. So let's say that right now, out loud. No one alive had anything to do with it. Nothing. So let's just take that off the table. And for a lot of people, their shoulders relax. It's like, oh, well, you're not blaming me for that. And it's like, no, that's not what we're talking about. And we may think, that's a simple thing, or why do you have to do that? And I always remind myself, what we are talking about here is asking people to challenge their creation story. And in any culture that's ever existed, people cling to a creation story because it helps define who they are. And so, there is going to be pushback, but facts are very hard to push against. And the more those facts become endemic in our culture, the more problem people are going to have preventing America from taking a very different road. Last thing I'll just say here is, look at the desperation of January 6th. Look at the desperation of parents of fourth graders screaming about not teaching their children CRT, which is a graduate school curriculum. The desperation that those things reveal tells me that there are a whole bunch of people who know the power of the truth about our history. And that if people understand all of it, people will make different decisions going forward. And if people think, that's kind of, a little bit too optimistic, I'm like, well, there are a whole lot of people who are freaking desperate to keep this information from being widespread. Why do you think they're so desperate?
So I want to come back to the gentleman, I'll use that term loosely, with the Confederate flag. I do want to mention that as a Portland native, the high school that I graduated from was named after Woodrow Wilson. And it took 70 years for them to finally change the name to Ida B. Wells High School. So that's something to think about. Getting back to that scene there, two questions. We had a question in the Q&A about what did it feel like to shake his hand? And I also wanted to ask you, do you believe that his views are representative of the views of the typical white male Southerner, or is he an anomaly?
I don't think he's an anomaly, and I don't think he's a typical white male Southerner. I think there are lots of people who have similar views, and I think many of them are simply ignorant. It doesn't mean they're not smart. They could be brilliant, but they're ignorant about the truth about our history. And I've seen this because, I've been giving the presentation that was kind of the backbone of this film. I've been giving that presentation in one form or another since 2012. And so it's the kind of thing where I've seen all kinds of people with different views. This guy, as I said, he was not an anomaly, but he's not representative of most white males down there. And I will tell you that I had a fairly serious conversation with Sarah and Emily about taking the handshake out of the film. Because after I shook his hand, there was a major part of me that felt like this guy would like to destroy everything about me and my entire community. He sees me as less than human, and why should I dignify him with shaking his hand? And so I felt bad. I felt angry at myself for shaking his hand. Then, as I told you earlier, there was the reaction of the JAG officer who said, you know, you may feel bad about it, but I'm telling you what, it's going to be an entry into the people I'm trying to talk to about this issue. And the bottom line is, I was raised in the South, and there are some things about Southern traditions that I still respect. And in the South, if someone you don't know agrees to speak with you and answer questions and have a conversation, you thank them and you shake their hand before you walk away. And, you know, I feel like had I not done, as I was doing it, I felt my parents on my shoulder, like, you better shake his hand. This man just talked to you in front of a camera when he didn't have to. And you didn't yell at him, but he didn't yell at you either. And so you better shake his hand. And so there was a major conflict internally that I felt, because I know what he represents and I know that his mind hasn't changed. But I no longer regret shaking his hand. I can't say I feel good about it, but I don't regret it.
Barbara, back to you.
Okay. Most marginalized ethnic groups have been the beneficiaries of United States reparations. Why is there so much vitriolic hostility and resistance for paying reparations to African Americans or descendants of enslaved people or marginalized African Americans? And you mentioned the Compensation Act of Lincoln in your movie, $300 per slave to former slave owners. So that's just an example of reparations being paid to people who did bad things.
Right.
So
I think one of the things that happens is that the narrative, you know, people say the South lost the war, but they won the peace, because the narrative they created about what the war was about and what happened post-war has been brilliant. And I think many people associate reparations with punishment. We are punishing white people who never owned enslaved people and giving the punishment money to Black people who were never enslaved by any white people because they were born after slavery. And I think that flies in the face of every notion of reparations. There is a notion of reparations that is religious. I think it's Deuteronomy, where they say, if one of your Hebrew brothers and sisters, if you own them for 6 years, in the 7th year, you will set them free. And when you set them free, you're going to give them everything of what you have. The land, your wine press, your animals, your food, and it's reparation. It was an acknowledgement of this harm. John Locke, you know, the political scientist, wrote about the concept of reparations. So reparations is not punishment. It has to do with a reckoning. I think the other thing that's very difficult for people is that this is not a harm that occurred in our lifetime. But even there, we've solved that problem before, because there were reparations paid to family members of Japanese Americans who were imprisoned during World War II, when the people who imprisoned them were dead and the people who had been imprisoned were dead. The generations were a little bit closer, but we've solved that problem. So I think these excuses have to do with you're criticizing America or having us admit that we did something wrong. And that is the mark of a great country. When you look at the 1988 Civil Rights Act, the Japanese American Reparations Act, which paid them $1.6 billion. When you look at the wording and what's in that act, it says, we imprisoned you not because of national security, but because of racism and weak leadership and like cowardice. I mean, it just was an acknowledgement of the horror of what happened and the responsibility for what happened. And I think, so there's two more things I want to say. I'm a criminal defense lawyer. So I've represented people that have done horrible things. And some of those people are some of the best people I have ever met. That's the dichotomy of human beings. People can be a saint in this moment and a sinner in the next moment. And so it doesn't diminish the United States in my eyes to recognize its past sins. It's like, of course they would be there. What makes us any different than anybody else? So I think getting over that hump is important. And the final thing is money. It's going to cost too much money. How do we pay it? It's going to be too hard to figure out. That's why you have a commission. That's what H.R. 40, the bill before Congress, does. It sets up an expert commission to study the issue and make reparatory proposals to Congress. So that's exactly what the Japanese American law was built on, 10 years of a commission study. So let's just study it and recognize when it comes to money, there could be direct payments to people. There could be no direct payments at all. There could be tax credits. There could be education credits. There are all kinds of ways that reparations could be paid to fix the community harm, because that's the harm that slavery and the vestiges of slavery has done. Yes, there are individuals in our community that have been harmed, but it's our entire community that has been harmed. And you need a remedy that will address the entire community. And remember, this is it. Congress came up with almost $5 trillion in about 3 weeks when it was in need of a stimulus package. So don't tell me that we don't have the money. They passed Juneteenth as a federal holiday. It cost, and I've done the research here, it cost about $450 million to shut down the government for one day, just in terms of like vacation pay and paying for people to come in on overtime if they're essential services. So what Congress did is to say, over the next 10 years, we are going to spend $4.5 billion to give people a holiday on Juneteenth. But don't talk to us about taking that $4.5 billion and investing it in the Black community. So I think if we can just get people to understand that this is not punishment, and that if this happens, everybody is better off. What would America look like if the poverty rate in the Black community was cut in half? And I didn't ask, what would the Black community look like? I said, what would America look like? This is an advantage for all of us. So I think it's a long struggle to get people to recognize this, but there are over 200 co-sponsors and yes votes on H.R. 40 in Congress right now. And depending on what happens in the midterms, we'll see what happens. For the first time in my lifetime, this is a realistic possibility going forward as opposed to a dream.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so obviously we in the Jewish community know all about reparations, and one have to look at Germany after the Holocaust. I want to stay on that topic, and here's what I want to ask you, Jeffrey. So about 2 weeks ago, at a Republican election rally in Nevada, Senator Tommy Tuberville, who made millions off of Black athletes as a college football coach, declared that Democrats support reparations for the descendants of enslaved people because, in his words, they think the people that do the crime are owed that. Tell me what you think is worse, his racist remarks or the silence from his fellow Republicans?
Well, I have become used to both. And Tommy Tuberville is an ignorant man. As you say, he made millions of dollars off the back of Black athletes and selling a dream that maybe came true for a very small number of them. But you can understand why athletes are coming out of college literally crippled and with no kind of professional career in that sport, because their coaches are, you're a piece of meat, get back out there, take this shot, get back out there, play for the team. And so Tommy Tuberville just showed his true colors. The silence among his co-Republican politicians, it really just speaks to me about so many people who say, I'm not a racist, and I don't want like all these horrible things that are happening in Black America to happen. I voted for Donald Trump because of economic policy, or because of this or that, or because I hated Hillary Clinton, and so don't lump me in with all those other people. And this is where, look, history is what it is. And the parallels to the late 20s and early 30s in Germany are horrifying. Because a whole bunch of people saw what was happening and sat and watched. Don't know if you have ever seen the scene from Cabaret, where the two men are sitting in a beer garden in Germany in the late 30s. And everyone's having a good time, and this young man stands up and starts to sing what sounds like a beautiful song, and everyone starts singing along, and then you see that he's wearing a Nazi armband. And by the end of the scene, what they're singing is, "Oh, fatherland, fatherland, show me the sign your children are waiting to see. I'll wake up to find that the world is mine. Tomorrow belongs to me." And the two men watching had been having this debate about, oh, don't worry about the Nazis, they'll get rid of some of this and that, but, they're not anything to worry about. And the one man looks at the other and says, you still think you can control them? There were a whole lot of people that sat and watched. And let me be clear, I'm not just saying this as kind of he's making an analogy. Go read Hitler's American Model, published in 2018. And it will demonstrate in speeches in the original German and translated into the English how the Nazis looked at Jim Crow laws to develop the Nuremberg laws. And the thing they said about Jim Crow is the Americans had the exact right idea. They just didn't take it far enough. They didn't put it against the Jews. And so when you understand that what happened in Germany had, at least as part of its base, the philosophical reality that was making itself manifest in America, that should tell you the danger of people who just want to remain silent. So anybody that said that to me about Trump, I'm not a racist, I'm like, maybe you aren't a racist, but you are completely comfortable voting for one. So you're turning to my community and saying, best of luck. I don't have any hard feelings, but I like his economic policy.
Go ahead.
Well, I've heard that a lot. And what I say to people that tell me they're voting or they voted for Donald Trump and it's nothing about race, that tells me more about you than it does about him.
Thank you.
And that, boom.
Thank you. Thank you very
Boom.
much. And quite frankly, those are the things that hurt more.
Mhm.
Those are the things that you hear from people who you have civil conversations with, who you share some commonality with. And, you're having a beer somewhere and it's like, oh yeah, well, I voted for him, but it was only because of this or that. And they have the privilege, to use that word intentionally, of driving home without worrying about what I have to worry about when I drive home. And they are perfectly willing to vote for and support somebody who wants to do more of that to me and people who look like me. So I try and hold my anger, but my respect for folks like that is running on empty.
Thank you. It's my turn, Bob.
It is.
Okay. What is the best? I know we've had a lot of focus on the wrongdoers and the evildoers, what's happening on that side of the fence, but what is the best, as an African-American man, you can answer this from personal experiences or observational. What is the best internal path for African-Americans to be on to rise above all of the marginalization and disfavor of this American society?
Unless we are talking about a radically different America, where we actually fund separate but equal. And I mean fund it so that it is absolutely equal. I'm not suggesting that that's what we should do, but there are many people who would say, America wants separate societies, just fund our community like you fund white communities, fund our schools like you fund white suburban schools, and let's see what happens. I'm not suggesting that, but for me, the only alternative to something like that is for not just Black Americans, but white Asian Americans, everyone to have a stake in fixing this. Black Americans can't do this on our own. We're 13 million people, or sort of 13% of, 300 million people. We cannot there's all kinds of things we can do for ourselves and have done for ourselves. One of the things I always tell people is, you look at the success of some Black Americans today, and some people say, oh, well, they made it, so why come these other people can't make it? And for the people that have been successful from our community today, it's not that we are somehow more special than somebody else. It's that despite all of the roadblocks that were put up, some of us snuck under the fence. Despite all of the effort to keep it from being that way, some Black Americans have been successful. And that is a testament to the strength of our community, not some indictment of our community about everybody can do it if you just try. So I think that America in general has to have a reckoning with this issue. That is why the Who We Are Project has a very narrow mission: education. We want to make the facts about our history endemic. And there are people, as I have already said, who are terrified of that idea. And let me just say, that terror goes all the way back to 1837. And John C. Calhoun, one of the most virulent racists in American history. And he wrote in 1837, 24 years before the Civil War, we have got to stop teaching abolition in the schools. We got to get the pastors to stop talking about it, and we got to get it out of the newspapers. Because if this young rising generation understands abolition, Slavery is done for. And we're going to end up in a war that will drench the country in blood. He predicted it a quarter century before it happened, and he knew that the key laid in the minds of the rising generation. And that's why you see all this struggle and strife today about what are our children going to be taught. It's not that, you know, these laws that are saying, oh, you can't teach things that make the children feel guilty. That's not what's happening. Because even a sixth grader knows, or a first grader who's 6-year-old knows, you can't make me guilty for something that I didn't do. That was somebody else that did that. Even a 6-year-old can figure that out. But what happens is those children get taught these things in school, and then they come home. Mommy, Daddy, did you know about this? Did our family have anything to do with this? Are we doing anything to fix it? Now, those are questions that will really make you uncomfortable. But I don't think you can legislate that kind of uncomfortableness away. So I think there are many, many things that have to be done. One of the lanes is to create an America where, as we start into a decision-making process, we actually reckon with the truth about our history. That has never happened before. We have reckoned with part of it, but we have downgraded and hidden the rest of it that relates to things, which is why 2 steps forward, 3 steps backward. So I think education is one of the major things. Make this endemic and get people talking about it, and let's see what happens.
Thank you.
So Jeffrey,
Bob?
in making this film, what was the most surprising thing you discovered, and what was the most painful thing that you learned?
I guess there may be there are 2 things that fit surprising and painful, and I guess both of them were both, but in different ways. One was the end of the conversation with Senator Hank Sanders at the bottom of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and his words were, you know, it's 50 years after we did all this stuff, and we're still fighting for this, we're still fighting for that, we're still fighting for this. And that just shows you the depths of white supremacy in this country. And then he said, and I didn't understand that. And if you watch the film again and you look at that part, his voice, you can actually hear his voice shaking a little bit. And that was like a slap in the face to me, because Hank Sanders is a frickin' hero. And, you know, a guy who grew up in Alabama, went to Harvard Law School, came right back to Alabama, lived his entire life there as a fearless advocate. And to hear him say, I underestimated what I was fighting, was a surprise and something very painful. And I think it was also interesting because you can't see it or hear it in the film because of the brilliant job our editors and our sound editor did. But you know, you could see 3 Black people talking to each other in front of a camera at the bottom of the Edmund Pettus Bridge. I don't think it took a genius to figure out what we might be talking about. And cars would come to the bottom of the bridge, and there's a stoplight there, and they would lay on their horns, just trying to disrupt the interview. And we thought for a while that we weren't going to be able to use the interview because the sound was so bad, but the editors did a brilliant job. And so I think that was one thing. And the other thing that was surprising and painful, but also joyous in a way, is my reconnecting with my buddy Opie Oriens and his older brother Dick, and finding out details about our trip to Walls, Mississippi in the late 60s that that I had never heard before. And that was surprising. I was shocked. I was like, what the F are you talking about? It was painful because, and I think I saw the film, in its early versions as we're working on it. I think I saw it like 30 times before I noticed that Dick was crying as he was telling that story. And he held that story for 50 years and never said a word to me, to Opie, not to my parents. Because he just didn't say anything to anybody. And it's remarkable when you go back and look at how he starts describing that. And he says, I tried to handle it professionally. Dick was 21 years old. And that was about 3 years after civil rights workers had been disappeared in Mississippi. And where he got the courage to do that, I just don't know. I don't know intellectually, but I know that from literally the first day Opie and I met, there were 9 children in the Oriens family, and I knew every single one of them. And I can Ray, Dick, Susan, Janet, Tom, Opie, Bill, Steve, Mike. I grew up with that family. And as far as Dick was concerned, I was Opie's best friend. That's all he needed to know. So I was like his little brother. And he wasn't going to come to me as an 11 or 12-year-old and say, you can't play because you're Black. And he wasn't going to go to our team and say, we can't play because Jeffrey's Black and they won't let him play. He was not going to put that on our shoulders. And so he had the courage to basically say, screw you, we're walking away. And then, he got the pastor to go back in that gym and they changed their minds. So, that's like just a little tiny thing, but heroic in a huge way. And the impact on me as an individual, what I can say is that, I was able to finish my preteen years without that trauma. So that was painful and surprising as well.
So, Barbara, before you go, let's go back to the Edmund Pettus Bridge for a moment and Hank Sanders. On our civil rights mission to Georgia and Alabama, we spoke to a Black leader in Selma by the name of Joanne Bland, who we know her as a young girl. I think she was 11 years old, experienced Bloody Sunday on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in 1965. And she told us how strongly she feels that the name of the bridge should not be changed for fear that doing so, in her words, would erase a part of that history. Now, obviously, Hank Sanders would disagree with that, but do you understand her point of view?
Oh, I understand it, but I think it is. I understand it. I don't agree with it. I think that there are all kinds of ways to memorialize what happened there. So if you named it the Freedom Bridge, you're going to have a huge plaque there that says Freedom Bridge, formerly Edmund Pettus Bridge. But because he was a KKK slime bag, we decided we were going to change the name. So there are ways to memorialize those things, but monuments throughout history have been connected with heroic, extra-human kinds of behavior that we want to glorify and remember and give thanks for. there were brilliant soldiers in the Nazi army. You don't see any monuments to General Rommel, who besides General Patton was probably the greatest tank commander in military history. You don't see one monument to General Rommel, because it's not how hard he fought, it's what he fought for. And by leaving Edmund Pettus's name on that bridge, it memorializes the grand wizard of the KKK in a way that he does not deserve if we are who we claim to be. So you don't have to lose the history, but you can change the name and maintain the history. I have no problem with a huge plaque saying exactly who Edmund Pettus was, but that's the problem. They just got his name on the bridge. There's no explanation of why his name is on the bridge. And that gets very, very tricky, doesn't it? So, you know, let's take it down, change the name, and give an explanation.
Amen. Okay, Barbara, back to you. But you are muted, Barbara. So you'll have to
I am not going to read one of my questions right now. I'm going to take a question from the Q&A. I think it's a good question. It's simple, and it's from one of the audience members. And her question is: since you live or lived in the Pacific Northwest, do you have any specific advice for us? And this is me editorializing on this. This is quite the place for nice racism.
Yes. So I still live in the Pacific Northwest. I'm a visiting professor at Boston College Law School this semester. So I'm here from August through the end of November, but then I'm back home in Seattle. And Seattle, like Portland, has some of the nicest racists that you would ever want to meet in your entire life. And that is the difference between conversation and communication on issues. And so if people never get to the issues where you have to say something that will reveal kind of who you are, then you know, you avoid the conversation, you avoid the issue completely. And I think people are brilliant at doing that in the Pacific Northwest. People are, you know, brilliant at sidestepping conversations. But one of the things that we can do, and I think this is the power of history, is to use our history to get to be able to then say to people, I understand, like, you know, why you haven't thought of this. I mean, God, I didn't think of it till I was in my 50s. But look at this stuff. Look at, you know, did you know, for example, if we just want to start back at the beginning, did you know that it was illegal for Black people to live in Oregon? And Oregon wasn't a slave state. Oregon's up here on the Pacific. Did you understand that they would run people out of the state with violence? And so when you can start talking about the history and then connecting the history to the present, and what, you know, people who say there's been so much, you know, there's so much change since the 60s, and I'm not denying that. I think, you know, if I can call you Barbara, both you and I look like we are of an age where we both know that what our parents grew up with is radically different than what we're facing. Some of it is exactly the same, but the kind of daily surface level indignities that they had to live with are, you know, it's just not even the same for the way that that we live now. But when you can talk about the history and then say something like, so in 1968, the Kerner report came out, and they did this full analysis of the economic health of the Black community. And then in 2018, the Economic Policy Institute came out with another report, 50 years to the day after the Kerner report. And they found that the gap between white and Black America had widened.
Right.
So if you think it was horrible in the 60s, understand that it's at some levels worse now. So is that enough for us to start talking about it? Because, and I think, this is the polite pushback on polite racism, because it's like, we need to have this conversation. And if you aren't willing to have this conversation, the polite relationship that we have is just not worth it to me. I'm going to move on. And when you're ready to have the conversation, come back. I'm not mad at you or anything else. But if you won't engage with me on this stuff, if you're looking at me and who I am and what community I come from, and you're telling me that you like me and you want to be polite to me, but you're not willing to engage with this with me, you're telling me I don't mean that much to you. So that's okay. I'm going to move on and try and work with people who maybe feel differently. And if you change your mind, give me a ring and let's move forward. But I think making people look in the mirror is one of the most effective tools. People can look in the mirror and not. One of my favorite bands has this lyric in one of their songs: if it's all right, how come you can't sleep at night? And one of the places, same band, has a lyric that essentially says, there is one place that no human being can hide from the truth. And that's between the click of the light and the start of your dreams. And we all know that's true. You turn out the lights and you're trying to fall asleep. And that's when the excuses don't work. And you kind of see things clearly. And, these thoughts come up about, oh, what am I doing? Oh, I don't want to think about that. I'm going to go to sleep here. And those are the moments that we need to push for. And if there are people that are actively avoiding those moments, I want to encourage them to come to the discussion. But I'm not going to spend any time and energy on a polite level relationship with them. It's just, I only got so many more days until I'm not here anymore. So I don't have time for that.
Thank you. Yeah, we're on the other side of the hill.
I put it this way. We have a long time to go, but we likely have fewer days in front of us than we have behind us. And so that says something to you about urgency. And I can tell, Barbara, that you feel the same. It's like, we're at a time where if you were ever going to do something, this is the moment where you ought to do it. And that's why Andrea Crabtree, my paralegal and now chief of staff at the Who We Are project, we had great jobs at the ACLU. We were running their criminal legal reform work and their racial justice work from the national office. And we left those jobs because we felt like this education piece was so critical, especially right now, that we wanted to take the biggest swing that we could at.
Well, we appreciate it. It's so needed. It's so necessary. And thank you for your answer.
So we have a question from our good friend, Pastor Matt Hennessy, whose church is a co-sponsor of the program tonight. So I'm going to have to put on my reading glasses to read this. I believe part of the rise of Mr. Trump was the backlash of President Obama being twice elected. Mr. Trump's legacy is of leading a country more concerned about cozying up to our adversaries and shunning our allies. At the same time, it unleashed a war among us racially and economically. We are a country far apart from one another. How do we field candidates for office who wish to heal our land and reimagine brotherhood and sisterhood, not just for us, but for generations after us?
Well, voting has been a critical thing throughout the country's history. And I know there are a lot of people who don't vote. That number, in the last election in 2020, it was actually one of the largest turnouts in American history. And from what I am reading right now, the turnout at polls in early election states is as high or higher than it was in 2020. So voting is a critical thing. And there are obviously, you know, I'm not trying to get into party politics, but there are people who tell you that there are certain freedoms that they want to restrict, and other people that tell you there are freedoms they want to support. If I will say this, if as many women as it appears disagree with the Roe decision, overturning Roe versus Wade, if all those women vote, the Republicans are done for in the midterms. There is no chance for them to win this election, because let's remember, and you know, these are just the statistics, there were a large number of white women nationally that voted for Donald Trump. And so, you know, part of my message to them is, you say you care about these rights, I guess we'll find out whether you do or not. And I think this midterm election is, you know, it's a very important one, and we will see the direction that America is headed. And I'm not saying, you know, I'm not predicting anything, and I'm not about a blue wave or a red wave. All I know is that people are now having discussions out loud that only occurred behind closed doors before. So people are saying, get rid of abortion rights, get rid of gay marriage, get rid of laws saying that you can have contraception, leave that to the states. There are all these kind of things, you know, all of this is surfacing. And while it scares the hell out of me, it also makes me feel like this. What do you think America would look like if it was about to make a significant turn toward racial justice in this country? What do you think it would look like? It would look exactly like it does. There would be people horrified about it. You would have the backlash of Donald Trump. You would have all kinds of crazy QAnon things going on. You would have people that would storm the Capitol on the day that the transfer of power was supposed to happen. And then you'd have parents of grade school children screaming about courses that their children aren't even being taught. So this is exactly what it would look like if we were about to make a turn toward true racial justice. And I'm not being, you know, Pollyannish. This is also what it could look like if we were about to take a huge step backward. And so this is an interesting time to be alive. And, you know, I guess the last thing I would say for the Reverend's question is, in terms of engaging with groups like the Jewish Federation, with groups like the two churches that have come together in Portland, informing people, making these conversations happen in your communities, in your work communities, in your family communities, in your neighborhood communities. If you're so moved by this film, how many other people are you going to get to watch it and then have a conversation? Or how many other people will you direct to our website, which is filled with information about all kinds of groups who are doing this work? The point being that at every tipping point in American history, we have rolled back when it comes to racial justice. And this time, this one, it's not on our great-grandparents or our forefathers and mothers. This time it's on us. So if you're wondering if now is the time to be engaged, and I'm saying this to as many people as I possibly can, and it's because it's one of the things that's driving me. I have a 5-year-old, I think you would call her a great niece, or I'm a grand uncle. She's the daughter of my niece, and she's 5 years old. And she calls me Poobah because I told her I was the grand Poobah. And at some point, she's going to ask me, what did you do when it looked like the country was going crazy? Did you do anything to give me a chance to have the same level of rights that my great-grandmother had. And I want to be able to answer that positively. So I would just say to everybody, don't say, I don't know what to do. Take a look around. All of us are intelligent people. Find groups that are doing this kind of work and get engaged. Because if we don't, you talk about people standing by and not doing anything. And I'm not interested in the America that may result from that.
Thank you. Bob, any comment?
No, Barbara, go ahead.
Okay, I'm taking this question from the viewing audience. And this person says, especially in light of Kanye's hateful comments, how do you assess the current state of national Black-Jewish relations? How much impact and traction do you think his comments are having within Black communities, including his derogatory comments on slavery and George Floyd?
Kanye West is a mentally ill person who, like Herschel Walker, is a white supremacist dream. They will say things that we want to say, and their skin is Black. So that means it's okay for us to say it. I think Kanye even said, I can say anti-Semitic stuff because Blacks are the original Jews. Kanye's remarks are hateful, ignorant, stupid, and quite frankly, you know, there are people in the Jewish community in the right-wing areas that have said incredibly hateful, stupid things about Black people. And I would hope that the Jewish community would judge Kanye West the same way the Black community should judge those on the right wing in the Jewish community that say these hateful things. There are people who are out there on the edge, and that's what they're saying. I have seen, because I look at a lot of Black media, all kinds of Black folks that are turning on Kanye West and basically saying, dude, you've gone too far this time. There is huge pressure on Adidas, which is a German company, to break ties with him. And virtually every other company has broken ties with him. And I read somewhere where he said, oh, I'm sorry if I hurt anybody. And look, if to the extent that this comes in part from mental illness, I have empathy for that, but the words are what they are, and words are dangerous. Especially, they've always been dangerous, but words have power. And so mental illness is no excuse for what he said or for what he's done. If mental illness is the problem and you're saying this kind of shit, then you need to go get treatment. And if you're not willing to do that, when you know that this kind of behavior is the consequence, then I'm not sure there's a hell of a lot of difference between you and a white person spouting KKK bullshit to Jewish people and or Black people. Because if you know you're doing it and you know there's a reason and you're unwilling to deal with that, once again, you're telling people, you know, this is more convenient for me to say this kind of stuff, so just live with it. So, you know, I will say, I love rap music, even though I'm 66 years old. And the guy wrote incredibly brilliant stuff. But being brilliant doesn't mean that you can get away with doing the kind of stuff that he did. There were a lot of very smart people in the Nazi Party, very intelligent people. But that doesn't mean it excuses what they did.
In other words, stay on your medication, Kanye.
Yeah, I wish I could say that to him, dude, just take the meds and let's see what happens. But he was off the rails with Donald Trump, and as you say, with the White Lives Matter t-shirt. And so he is clearly looking for attention. And once again, when you talk about people who either tolerate him or support him, what kind of person would try and get political leverage or gain from somebody that's mentally ill and is spewing all kinds of racial shit? How low do you have to go to try and take advantage of that kind of behavior?
Right.
Thank you.
Of the few things that I did not learn from your film about Andrew Jackson, I had learned about him some time ago. And it always bothered me that his face, as you mentioned in the film, is on our $20 bill. Should there not be a campaign to remove his face from our currency? And how?
Absolutely. And quite frankly, the decision had been made, and Harriet Tubman was going to replace Andrew Jackson, and the last administration slowed that process down. So, you know, he was a remarkable person. And it's not just what he did in the Black community. You know, he championed and listen to the name of this law, the Indian Removal Act.
Right.
And that law did exactly what the description in your mind says it did. And one of the things that just infuriated me is that the end or near the end of his presidency, President Trump recognized, I think, either the only two of only a very, very few surviving members of the Navajo Nation who were code talkers in World War II. He brought them to the White House and he had a ceremony with them right in front of a portrait of Andrew Jackson, who was a mass murderer of Native Americans. And so, you know, you look at it and you say, oh, maybe it's a mistake. I just, you know, that's not a coincidence. And just a little dig, you know, and Andrew Jackson was a great man. You know, he may have slaughtered a whole bunch of Native Americans, but I'll bring two members of the Navajo Nation and make them stand right in front of his photograph or of his portrait. I think it's shameful.
Thank you. Barbara, we have a question from Catherine Brown, another good friend of ours from the congregation. Along with voting in the November election, can you share your thoughts on the 13th Amendment and the Abolition Amendment on the ballot in several states?
So the 13th Amendment, as it was written, outlawed slavery except for people who were convicted of a crime. And when you start looking at the history of the United States after 1865, very, very quickly, states all over the country started passing laws that could essentially criminalize Black life. And so removing that clause from the 13th Amendment, number one, it takes a constitutional amendment. So you got to have 2/3 of the states that are, you know, that would vote for it. And number two, it would make a huge sea change in American law about prisons and prisoners. There's a reason that prisoners can be made to work for like 15 cents an hour. It's the 13th Amendment. There's a reason that courts will rule that prisoners don't have certain rights that are, you know, you would think would be absolutely common, even for incarcerated people. The 13th Amendment and its inclusion, its preservation of slavery and involuntary servitude for those convicted of a crime has had a huge impact on the American criminal legal system. I think it's a fantastic idea. And it's the kind of thing where, you know, it's not like it has to pass the first time, or it's not like it has to pass at all. The movement for a constitutional amendment on women's rights in the 70s and 80s ended up failing. We didn't have the Women's Rights Amendment. But the leverage and the political will that came from that movement made huge changes in the law in America in terms of women's rights. And so moving for, developing steam for a constitutional amendment to change the 13th Amendment, for me, is the kind of movement that is beneficial, not just if it's successful in changing the American Constitution, but if it is successful in engaging in a discussion about these issues that where we have never gone before. All these issues we're talking about, we have discussed before, but what's happening today is we are taking these discussions further than they have ever been taken in my lifetime. That's not to say that there weren't some people talking about these things, but you don't have the internet. You don't have the instant communication. You don't have the ability to reach so many people. So the level of conversations about racial justice going on in the United States right now are unique. And I think that's a place where we have to take advantage of the moment that we're in.
Thank you. Barbara? Barbara, you need to unmute. Just stay unmuted.
Sorry about that. Okay, so now that you've done the project, the Who We Are project, what's next for you? What are your plans? What are the plans of the organization that you have founded and the two women that were the producers? Do you have a sequel to this? Are you planning on doing more? Or are you just going to run with this maybe for the next 5 years?
Well, the movie is the first thing that the Who We Are project, the first major thing that we have done publicly. We are going to be doing all kinds of things, especially as we get into next year. So one thing I would tell folks is come to our website, thewhoweareproject.org, and see what we're doing. There are 3 areas where we are trying to have a major impact in America, and it's all about education. So we want to have what we're calling days of learning in states that have anti-CRT laws. We want to go and rent a major auditorium in the biggest city in the state. We want to blanket 4 or 5 counties around that city with major publicity. We want to partner with local groups, with advocacy groups, with religious groups, with secular groups. We'll hold these things on a Saturday so it doesn't violate any law about teaching this in a school. We'll hold it in an auditorium so it's not in a school building. We will invite the governors of the state and the state legislators who have passed these laws, and we will bring in national speakers on racial justice and local speakers who can tell the local history of the city that we're in and the state that that city is in. And so having these days of learning that we will film, we will live stream across the country as well as having a live audience, and that we will film for use by the Who We Are project later. It's a way to get into these states and go right to the place that they are most afraid of. Let's go to the kids and get them in. I forgot to say, our plan is that we will feed everybody by making agreements with Black-owned restaurants to provide food for people so they can come for most of the day on Saturday and leave with a whole bunch of information. The other thing we're going to do is what we're called truth tellers trainings. We want to go into the Black community and find young advocates and train them to do exactly what I did. I think I'm a really good speaker, and that's because I was trained to be a criminal defense lawyer, and I was taught how to be a good orator. We want to teach people how to speak to audiences. We want to teach people what you can do with an iPhone if you can't afford a $100,000 camera to film somebody. We want to teach people how you do original source document research and then send these folks back into their communities so that they can do the same kind of investigations that I have done, and that we will then take them and host those things on our website so that we will have a virtual library and museum of original source documents, detailed research, and narratives of people who are still alive connecting with real life issues in the civil rights movement. One of the things we're going to tell these kids is, and when I say kids, I'm 66, so young people in my community to me means like anybody younger than 50 would be somebody we'd be looking to do this. And part of it is telling them, take advantage of what I never took advantage of. I had a great grandmother who was born in 1878. Her parents were enslaved. I never talked to her about what that was like, about what her experiences were. There are people alive right now who lived through incredibly important, traumatic, and country-changing events and times. Recording those people so that they're not lost. One of the most valuable things that we did, I think, in our film is to record Mother Randall in Tulsa. She was 107 years old. She will not be here much longer. And she's been recorded by other people, but we have a way of making her story live much longer than her body will last. And so this is all in our narrow kind of lane of education. We want to educate people, both students and community members, and quite frankly, corporate organizations, because we have a lot of corporations getting in contact with us saying, hey, what can we do? And we're saying, give us a day to present to your corporation, and then let us connect you with DEI experts who can evaluate your corporation and give you some suggestions. And here's one suggestion. If you're in a corporation, take your last year's financial records, get rid of everything that's salary and benefits, and look at everything that's left, from where you spend the money for your paper clips to your most expensive consultants and everything in between. How much of that went into the Black community? And the answer is probably virtually none. What would happen if you told your planners in your corporation, take the next 6 months. I'd like you to come up with a plan that will show us investing our needs and engaging in partnerships with businesses in the Black community. And I'd like to have that at this level in the next 3 years. What would happen if they did that? Doesn't take the government to tell them to do that. They can do that all by themselves. So I think we are trying to engage people by educating them and getting to them to that moment of cognitive dissonance where they say, wait a minute, I didn't know this. And that's the moment when maybe they do something different. That's where the Who We Are project is going to be spending our time and effort.
Great. You know, what you were just talking about, the oral testimonies, reminds me a lot of the oral testimonies of the Holocaust survivors. And of course, they are also dying off at a very fast pace, and that's unfortunate, but we need to learn their stories. Here's the thing, and this is the thing, when people talk about the term intersectionality, this is a prime example. None of this is new, because this has happened repeatedly throughout history. And so lessons that should have been learned in the 20s and 30s in Germany didn't get learned, or at least didn't get learned well enough. And, you know, an idea floats all around the world in a moment. So I think that the more that people can see the connections between
folks that want to roll us back to whatever it was back there. And I can just tell you that I can't imagine anybody in a Jewish community or an African-American community, a Jewish American community or an African-American community that's interested in going back, because we know what that means. We know what we're going back to. And so I think that find your lane. We found this education lane and it's narrow, but we're going to take up as much space in that lane as we can. We are going to be getting to people in as many ways as we can. So we are working on another film. And we think we will have a short film about the 1876 election that Tom Hanks is going to narrate, that we hope will be in South by Southwest next year. We'll see. But we are working on new things right now, and it's just a matter of building the organization so that we have more than me and Andrea doing it.
I just want to end on this question, because we talked about it earlier before everyone joined us. You did this film with 2 white women, and I want you to tell us why that was important.
I got a phone call from Sarah Kunstler, who said, I just saw the presentation you did in federal court here, and my sister Emily and I would like to talk to you. And I said, sure. And I hung up the phone. I'm like, have coffee with the daughters of William Kunstler? Yeah, I'll agree to that no matter what. I was just fascinated by who they were. And I knew I knew their last name and the legacy of their father and their mother, but I didn't know them. But, you know, I've been a criminal defense lawyer since 1981. I got friends all over the country. So I started calling up my homies in New York City. What about Sarah Kunstler? Is she the real deal? And they're like, absolutely, she is the real deal. So we met, they had coffee. I don't drink coffee, so I had hot chocolate. And they said, we'd like to make your presentation into a film. And I just started laughing. So I wish I could tell you there was like a master plan for how this happened. I just started laughing. I'm like, I'm a criminal defense lawyer. I'm working for the ACLU, but really I'm a criminal defense lawyer. And my presentation is a PowerPoint presentation. This isn't a film. We figured out by looking at our calendars that meeting occurred on June 20th, 2017. And on June 19th, 2018, 364 days later, we were in front of 7 cameras in Town Hall Theater in New York with a sold-out audience, and we filmed the theater portion of the movie and then went around the country on my quote-unquote free time, meaning leave New York Thursday night and come back Sunday so you can go back to work on Monday. Went around the country filming these things. Sarah and Emily came to me and they said, this is your film. You will own the entire film. So that when we sold the distribution rights to Sony Pictures Classics, every penny of that went to the Who We Are project for our work. That couldn't have happened if Sarah and Emily hadn't agreed to that. Because remember, they have experience in movie making. I didn't. And there were folks at the ACLU who actually came to me very concerned and saying, Jeff, we just don't want you to get taken advantage of. And, you know, we'll pay for the whole film. And they were doing this generously. I mean, it wasn't like anything nefarious, but, you know, they were saying, we'll pay for the whole film, but then we'll own it. And we'd like to have input into what's in it. And it wasn't that I didn't trust and love those folks, but it's like, you know, this is something I've been working on for a long time. And I know what I want to say. And I'm really not interested in what the ACLU may want to say on this topic. So Sarah and Emily not only said, the money will go to your work, but they also said, you have final editorial control. That was stunning. And when we were having meetings at the ACLU, the people from the ACLU who have done movies before are like looking around the room at each other going, is that really, that can't be true. That's really true. And that made me think, okay, these women are stepping outside the box in what they're trying to do with me. And I think the most important thing is that this history that we have used to make this film and that we are using in our future work, this history was stolen from all of us. not just Black Americans. It was stolen from white Americans, from Asian Americans, from Jewish Americans. It was stolen from all of us. And it is on all of us to reckon with it and to recover it. It is not just the responsibility of Black America to recover and bring forward this information. It's the responsibility of anybody who says they actually believe in the stuff that we claim to be when we talk about the United States as a free democracy. So I think, as I said before, this problem will not get solved by a single racial group in this country. It's going to take a collaboration of a whole bunch of people, and Sarah and Emily are the dictionary definition of allies in a fight for racial justice. And meeting them was probably, in terms of this work, it's probably the luckiest day of my life.
Wow, that is a great note to end on. And I'm sure there's a lot of folks in our audience who are inspired to do something. I know I am, and I know Barbara is and has. And so with that, Jeffrey, thank you so much for staying up so late. And I understand you have yet another thing to do tonight. So I want to thank Andrea as well. It's just really informative and inspiring. And I think that this film should be required in every public high school class for social studies or American history.
Well, I appreciate it, and we got plans there too. So we're having sneaky meetings with teachers unions and all kinds of people. So keep an eye out for us, because we plan to take as big a swing as this as we can. And thank y'all for taking the time to watch the film and taking the time to have this conversation. It's greatly appreciated.
Right.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Was
you,
a
everyone,
pleasure.
for joining us
Take
today.
care.
Take care.